Okay, our next strategic decision is whether or not we should take a product and continue to process it under the notion that we'd be able to sell it for a higher amount later. So Clorox Company produces cleaning compounds, and 40 grit is a coarse cleaning powder meant for commercial use. It costs $1.60 a pound to make and sells for $2 a pound. You can take 1/4 of a pound of 40 grit and further process that into Gold Buff, which is going to sell for $4 per unit. So the additional processing costs are $2.50 per unit of Gold Buff, and the variable costs are 30 cents per unit. So if Gold Buff were discontinued, $5,600 of fixed costs could be avoided. So if we assume unlimited demand but limited capacity for 40 grit, how much Gold Buff needs to be sold to justify the additional processing of 40 grit? So the key is to identify the relevant costs and revenues associated with any 40 grit that would be diverted for production of Gold Buff. Okay, so the incremental fixed costs for Gold Buff were $5,600. So now we need to calculate what is the incremental contribution margin per unit sold. Well, recall that we could sell Gold Buff for $4. The opportunity cost, so what we lose out on, is the opportunity to sell that 40 grit instead. So 40 grit sold for $2 a pound. Recall that it only took 1/4 of a pound to make Gold Buff, so we take 1/4 of that, that's 50 cents. Then there's the additional out-of-pocket costs, which is the additional processing of $2.50 plus the additional variable cost of 30 cents. So that totals $2.80. So when we think about what is the contribution margin of our Gold Buff, it's the $4 selling price minus the 50-cent opportunity cost minus the $2.80 out-of-pocket costs, or 70 cents. So to justify diverting 40 grit to produce Gold Buff, and therefore incurring that additional fixed cost of $5,600, we would need to sell at least the $5,600 divided by the 70-cent contribution margin per unit, or 8,000 units of Gold Buff to make this worth it. Okay, now we're going to talk about whether to keep or drop a particular product. So think of this as you have two production lines and you're deciding whether you want to keep one, keep the other, or maybe drop both. But in this case, we're comparing the two lines. So Babar Corp has two lines, trunks and tails. And tails has been performing poorly recently. And so Babar is considering cutting tails and selling only trunks. So if tails is dropped, then trunk sales will increase by 10%. But for the most part, otherwise, the cost structure is going to stay the same. So let's examine the cost structure of each of these products, right? So we have the sales of trunks and tails. We have their variable cost of goods sold. So sales minus variable cost is our contribution margin, minus fixed corporate cost, then minus our variable selling, minus our fixed selling. That gives us our total expenses. And if we deduct total expenses from margin, we get our operating income. And you can see why they think tails has been performing poorly, because in fact, they're losing money on the tails product. So probably again, the knee-jerk reaction here is, oh, we need to dump tails. The problem is we should reformat these into the actual contribution margin structure, right? So remember, contribution margin says include all the variable costs in order to get the contribution margin. So if we redo that, we'll see that the contribution margin for trunks is 110,000, or a contribution margin ratio of 55%. And the contribution margin for tails is 80,000 for a contribution margin ratio of 30.7%. So thus a 10% increase in trunks is going to yield 20,000, right? That's the 10,000, or sorry, that's 10% times 200,000 of sales now, times the 55% contribution margin ratio, or that will generate 11,000 more of operating profit. If we no longer operate tails, we will lose the 80,000 of contribution margin. But remember that fixed costs do not change. So as a result, the net decrease in profits is actually 80 minus the 11 additional we'd make, or 69,000. So in reality, we should not discontinue tails. Because what's happening is we're allocating part of the fixed costs over to tails. Well, that fixed cost will remain even if we shut that production line down. So even though in total we don't seem to be making any money, there is a positive contribution margin from the tails product. Okay, so what if instead fixed costs were reduced by 45,000 if we got rid of the tails product? So how much would trunks need to increase to make this worth it? Okay, so recall that we're going to lose the tails contribution margin of 80,000 if we drop that product line. But now we're going to gain lower fixed costs of 45,000. The implication is we would need to generate an additional $35,000 profit from trunks. Well, we know the contribution margin ratio, and we know the amount of profit we need to generate, so we can do a little algebra and determine that the amount of additional sales we need is another 63,636. So since existing sales are 200,000, we would need another almost 32% increase in sales to warrant dropping tails, even if it reduces fixed costs by 45,000. Okay, so now we're going to do the same sort of problem, except we're going to think about something called constrained optimization. So Empire produces two types of carpeting in its factory, low and high. And low carpet sells for $16 per square yard, and high carpet sells for $25 per square yard. So that's why they're called low and high. It's a low-cost product and a high-cost product. So variable manufacturing costs are only $10 for low, but they're $15 for high. So it's probably because it's of a higher quality. It takes 12 hours to produce 100 square yards of low, but it takes 18 labor hours to produce 100 square yards of high. The factory in this case is limited to only 4,600 hours per week. So think of it as either due to the size of the factory, the size of the labor force, whatever it might be. They can only work 4,600 hours per week. And presume that's 3 shifts running every day with the maximum number of personnel available. So the sales forecast indicate that weekly sales in square yards for low are 30,000 and 8,000 for high. If fixed manufacturing costs per square yard are $1.50 for low and $2.25 for high. So using this information, what is the gross profit and margin for these two products in total and per square yard? Okay, so if we think about what is our gross profit and our gross profit per square yard for low, so we're going to sell 30,000. And we're going to do that times the $16 selling price. So we're going to generate 480,000 of sales. Our variable costs are $10 a unit times the same 30,000 units. And our fixed costs are $1.50 per unit, or 45,000. So our gross profit is the 480 minus the 300 minus the 45, or 135,000. If we divide that by the 30,000 square yards, that's $4.50 per square yard. Now if we look at high carpet for a second, our sales is $25 per square yard times the 8,000 units, or $200,000. Variable cost is 15, fixed cost is 225, and so we determined that our gross profit is 62,000 divided by the 8,000 of units. That's $7.75 of gross profit per square yard. Okay, so think of this as now we know which one makes both. So let's look at the contribution margin and the contribution margin per square yard for both. So the contribution margin is the sales minus just the variable cost. So for low, that's the 480 minus the 300 or 180. So per square yard divided by 30,000, that's $6 of contribution margin per square yard. So for high, it's 200,000 minus the variable cost of 120. That's contribution margin of 80,000 or $10 of contribution margin per square yard. And now we can compute the contribution margin per labor hour, recalling that that's what's fixing our constraint, right? That's what's maximizing our optimization is we can only do 4,600 hours in total. Okay, so on a per labor hour, low is $6 of contribution per square yard. The labor hours per square yard are 12. So that means the contribution margin per labor hour is $50. So for the high-priced carpet, contribution margin per square yard is 10. The labor hours per square yard were 18, which means my contribution per labor hour is $55.56. Okay, so now we know how much contribution margin we're getting out of each labor hour. So when we think about what our constraint is, it's labor hours. So the first thing we want to do is manufacture as much of that higher contribution margin per labor hour product that we can. So since the contribution margin for high was 55.56, and that's larger than low, we need to make as much of the 8,000 square yards of that product as we can. So recall that's 8,000 square yards times the 0.18 of labor hours per square yard. So we're going to occupy of our 4,600 square yards, 1,440 of that we're going to use making high carpet. Well, that leaves us with a balance of 3,160 to use for low. And so that's going to be our production capacity for low. So now we've taken the fact that our production is constrained and we've determined what is the way we're going to optimize our profits by making as much of the right product as we can. Special order, make or buy, including its subset lease or buy. Additional processing and keep and drop. All classic business decisions. Hopefully these examples demonstrate the power of these tools for helping make good decisions. Like the Moneyball video we watched a few modules ago, business can no longer rely solely on gut decisions. Thanks for watching.